Thank you, Scott, for accepting our invitation. Sكوت ريتبرج is Professor of Digital Culture in the Department of Linguistic, Literary and Aesthetic Studies at University of Bergen in Norway. And his latest book, it's called Electronic Literature, and it was published at the end of 2018 or early
December in the UK, January in the US.
Okay, so it's almost 2019. This is, I think, a really wonderful work that brings together 20 years of research and practice-based research and offers really wide entry into the field of electronic literature for those who are not familiar with the field, and also places electronic literature in the wider history of experimental literature. I think I should also highlight the fact that Scott is an experimental artist. So he has been doing many kinds of works with digital media and experimenting with software and in general with what we can describe as the properties or features of the media, computational media. And I would highlight works, we could describe them as fictional or written works, like, for instance, email novels or email experiments in narrative using email. But I think the most significant work is expressed in a series of film, poems, experimental films that he has made with Roderick Hoover. In many of these films, you see what we can do when we use combinatory processes that are possible thanks to digital media. These films apply many techniques that we recognize from, for instance, constraint-based literary art, the kind of art that was practiced by Ulipo and other groups. So there are several projects. I would highlight two of my favorites, and I just learned about a recent one that I've not seen yet. Toxicity, a reflection about our situation in the post-climate change world, and also Arts and Minds, the Interrogations project. This one is based on exploring descriptions of soldiers who went to fight the war in Iraq, and it's set up as a virtual reality combinatory interactive experience. So his work has been exhibited in many places and is also a recognized author within the community of electronic literature as both, as I said, scholar and artist. So he won, I think, the Hoover Award for the Arts and Minds project, which is a major literary art award in 2016, and this year, 2019, he won the Anne Catherine Hales Award for this book, Electronic Literature. So, thank you, Scott, for being here, and we are looking forward to listening to you.
Thanks so much, Benoit. Yeah. I'm just going to turn on my timer here because thank you for the invitation to come here and talk to you for this, what I think is really an important conference. I submitted an abstract as soon as I saw the call because I think this is such an important topic because we have many gatherings about electronic literature, but there haven't been many yet focused specifically on teaching electronic literature. So it's been great the last couple of days to hear from people who are actually sort of in the trenches trying this out with students in a bunch of different contexts, and I hope it will continue. So my talk is pretty unscripted. What I have is a pile of slides, so I'm going to keep an eye on my time. We might not get through everything, but we'll see how it goes. Mainly what I want to talk to you about today is my recently published book, Electronic Literature. And this comes out of teaching electronic literature for 20 years and really not having a text. So what I really wanted to do was to put together a book that would look at the histories and genres of electronic literature, and rather than focusing narrowly in on one specific phenomena, to try to address as much of the field as possible in a way that would invite people who were sort of unfamiliar with electronic literature into it, and also a book that just selfishly that I could use in the courses that I teach to introduce my students to it. As Manuel said, I just put this slide in earlier this week just because I was very excited last week to win the N. Catherine Hales Award, which means a lot to me. N. Catherine Hales is one of the most renowned scholars in the field, and she's been a great influence on my career. I edited the first electronic literature collection with her, and her book 10 years ago was titled Electronic Literature, New Horizons for the Literary. And this was the first, in some ways, one of the first books to kind of try to bridge the gap between traditional literary studies and electronic literature. So when I titled my book Electronic Literature with no New Horizon, people were at first a little, isn't that Kate's title? And I said, well, yes, but what we really want to do is look at electronic literature not as a new horizon, but 10 years on, a decade on, when we're looking at a really rather large corpus of work, a large body of work, an international field of practice. So even though I was initially opposed to the idea of the man on the moon that my publishers pushed for the cover, once I thought about Hale's New Horizons for the Literary, it seemed appropriate to place an astronaut on the moon, as it were, sort of beyond those new horizons into the present. So during this talk, I'm hoping to do three things. By the way, the PowerPoint now suggests layouts for your slides, so some of these are AI-generated professional-looking slides. I want to provide you with an overview of my book. I want to share some of my experiences teaching electronic literature in different contexts, really, and I want to offer up some ideas of how electronic literature can be taught in different contexts. So literary studies, creative writing, as a sort of critical approach to digital culture, and as a digital humanities discipline. Okay, so I start out the book by asking people to imagine a book as a technology, and think about the properties of the book. That the book's a technology that took a long time to develop. There's these different aspects of a technological apparatus to it that took a lot of thinking to develop the Codex book. And so appreciate that every time we're opening a book, we're looking at a reading technology, right? And then to imagine that the book were different. Imagine it offered other affordances and material properties. Imagine that instead of turning pages, you could make any word in the book a link to some other part of the book or even to some other book. Imagine it were bound on a spool so that you could enter and exit anywhere. A book without beginning or end. Imagine what you would do with that as a storyteller. Imagine what it would mean if every time you put the book up on the shelf, the words on the book shifted and rearranged themselves. Would it be the same book? What would you do with that as a poet? Imagine if when you pulled the book down from the shelf and opened up the first page, the book asked you in what direction you wanted to go and would not begin to tell a story until you responded. Imagine if the book were a conversation, a novel that you had to talk to. Imagine that as you read a poem on the page of the book, the words jumped off the page into three-dimensional space and began flying around the room, shifting form and regrouping in the physical environment. Imagine that when you opened the book, it was filled with threads, connecting it to all the other books in your library, which would make it possible to pull part of another book right into the text of the one you were reading. Imagine if the book could read the newspaper and change its content depending on the time of the day or the weather or the season. Imagine if you opened the book and found all of those of your friends who are reading the book at the same time, leaving their comments in the margins. Imagine that when you opened the book, those same friends were all writing the book simultaneously. Imagine the book as a network, always on, always connected, and always changing. Imagine what you could do as a reader. Imagine what you could do as a writer. Imagine the book as a network computer. So the main approach that I'm taking in the book is somewhat controversial in that it's somewhat traditional. I'm looking at this and thinking about genre. Now, why genre? So some people say, well, that's not cutting edge, that's not new. This goes back to ideas of formalism and structuralism that stretch back at least a century. But this comes out of my experience teaching, that it makes logical sense to say, all right, when we look at this group of objects together, what are their commonalities? It gives us a basis for comparing things to each other and a basis for sort of understanding and moving past the interface. So when I think about genre, though, in electronic literature, you're always going to have what you might say threads of practice rather than traditional genres. And you're going to have oftentimes many different threads of practice within the same work. Also, when we think about genre, we're going to be thinking both about literary genre and about technological genre, which is sort of a different thing, in that the technological material properties of the form shape its poetics in a different way. The other thing that I encourage people to think about throughout this book is the cultural context in which both the technology and the work is produced, right? I should have, sorry. Traditionally people have talked about electronic literature as avant-garde. This was kind of the cutting edge hypertext 1990s vision, reinventing the word. And instead, I encourage people in a way to think, okay, yes, this is responding to the avant-garde. And when we look at these genres, we're going to see the marks of history of the avant-garde. But you might say, in a way, we're looking at a garde derrière, to quote my friend Talon Mehmet, in the sense that the authors who are working in these genres are kind of taking some practices from experimental literature and art of the 20th century and then adapting them into a new technological context and doing different things with them. But many of these ideas, and other writers, Manuel Portela is a notable one, have commented on this, and I think a lot of the Portuguese scholars have also noted this, that there is a connecting thread between experimental literature from the 20th century and the things that people are doing now with the computer. And that connecting thread might also make it a bit easier for us to understand these things. So the other reason why I'm sort of emphasizing on this approach is that if you don't know your history, and if you say we're inventing something new completely every time, you're just reinventing the wheel unnecessarily. So if you know your history, then you know where you're coming from. And there's kind of two traditional approaches to literary studies. One is to say, let's focus on the rupture. Let's focus on how this breaks with tradition. The other approach is to focus on continuity and to say, how are we understanding these things passing together in time and responding to each other? And that's maybe more of the thread that I'm focusing on, because I believe that while rupture is exciting, continuity is the basis for building a field. So this book really is a toolbox. It's meant to be used, it's meant to be applied in the classroom, and it's meant to, in some ways, help people get over some of their hang-ups about where these things are coming from. Also, their pretensions that they're reinventing the future that's already passed. I focus on what I think are 5 essential genres in 5 of the main chapters. One is combinatory poetics. This is the oldest sort of thread of computational literature, arguably stretching back to at least the 1950s. Hypertext fiction is the first one that sort of gained widespread critical attention, boomed and then maybe withered a bit in the early 2000s. Interactive fiction, this is a form that stretches back to the earliest computer games that were made textually, where the player responded using text, and has been a tradition that continued. And then other forms that use game vernaculars now. Kinetic and interactive poetry. This is something where we have in Portugal certainly a long tradition that stretches back to visual poetry, concrete poetry, other forms of visual poetry on the page, and network writing, writing practices that are specific to the network context. So I'm going to very quickly march through the contents of the book just to give you a quick impression. I'm not going to highlight everything here. In the first chapter, we look at these ideas of genre. We look at the history of theoretical, critical, and analytical work in the field to really establish a sense of the field, and we discuss why would we want to go about reading electronic literature to begin with. What are the strengths of this approach, and what are the things that we don't usually think about for students in particular that this offers us. Then we look at combinatory poetics. So we start with the context, the artistic context, and the history. We look at the idea of procedural syntactic generation systems. We look at more contemporary, because this really is a tradition that you can look at over the course of more than 50 years. We look at contemporary things like bots that generate text, not including those that manipulate elections, but those that are specifically meant for poetry. And new forms of generative poetry like David Jave Johnston's Rewrites project, which use neural nets to generate poetry. Hypertext fiction, which I think the reason why this attracted so much critical attention early on is that it really does kind of spring from modernism and postmodernism. And in particular, I focus on the book on metafiction and reflexivity, something, again, Manuel looks at a lot with the medium. Then we look at the sort of evolution of hypertext as a technology. It's obviously been a very important technology if you think about, and maybe not too many people think about this, but when you log into a web page, the first 4 letters you type are HTTP, and that stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, right? And HTML is hypertext markup language. So hypertext, in addition to being a sort of form that we can think of in literary contexts, is also sort of the basis of the World Wide Web and many computational systems. Then we look at the sort of first generation hypertext, which were pre-web. There was a lot of work done before the web, and then as it moved on to the web. Interactive fiction, we start with the earliest text adventure games. And the interesting thing that happened was this was a booming industry for a short period of time. Then graphics cards came along, right? And Space Invaders came along. And suddenly what was really a game form based on writing, the industry dropped out. Really interesting thing happened, though, is that a lot of people love these things and miss these things, developed their own platforms, developed their own language for writing adventure games, and this sort of amateur community took place and kept developing this form, and then indeed developing it in much more interesting literary ways. We look at some of the features of these types of games and some of the possibilities that they offer, and then this kind of interesting resurgence, recombination with hypertext that has happened in the form of twine games. And then we look at some of the ways that artists are just using game platforms now as literary platforms. Kinetic poetry is again a form that's rooted in literary tradition, coming out of, and we can, again, go back more than 100 years, looking at concrete poetry, symbolism, futurism, lettrism, visual poetry, some sound poetry practices, even title sequences. This is something John Cayley's written about. Before we move into early work in digital poetry, of course, again, I would mention Pedro Barbosa and other Portuguese authors were very cutting edge in both combinatory and kinetic poetry very early on. And then I spend some time just looking at how have particular technological platforms shaped the ways, the sort of poetics of kinetic and visual poetry over time, because that's an important interaction. And then sort of looking at how we balance movement and interactivity with meaning in digital poetry. Finally, some of the most exciting forms particular to the network. Writers have been saying, okay, we've developed all these new writing and communication technologies. How are they changing the way that we write, but also how do they offer us new forms for storytelling, new forms for poetry? So things like code work, which are sort of assemblages of human and machine language. Flarf, which is poetry that's generated using search engines in different ways. Early examples of fictions that were wrapped around the conventions of homepages, email novels, fictional blogs, fictions that take place on Twitter, different kinds of online writing communities, different forms of collective narrative projects, netprov or network-based improvisation. And then something that I think is really important right now is the idea of network critique. In other words, that because electronic literature includes reflective literary artifacts, in some ways it's the best form for us to look at and comprehend changes that are happening in the way that we think and communicate that might be happening too fast, that probably are happening too fast, for us to stand back and process and think about. And I think many of the most interesting works of electronic literature are doing exactly just that. Finally, the last chapter, to be honest with you, was because my publisher told me I could only have 200 pages, and I was already about 20,000 words over. So this became an omnibus chapter, where I look at a number of different forms that kind of combine different elements of the core genres. So locative narrative, these are narratives that are situated in physical space and physical environments where you actually go to places and you get a section of a story or interact with a story in a physical environment. Interactive textual installations. If you followed Roberto Simonowski's talk opening keynote, he discussed some of these installations that use text as a material, arguably meaningfully or not meaningfully. And then some of the sort of work that I've been doing in recent years, using some of the techniques from electronic literature in cinema contexts. And there are examples, again, of these going back to the 1960s at least. But thinking about how to expand the cinematic environment, how to place stories in things like cave 3D virtual reality theater environments, or how to use combinatory poetics to create versions of films that I was showing one as you walked in that was recombining and writing sonnets that will be different every single time the film runs. But sort of using some of those techniques. And then as we begin to think about how we use augmented reality for literature. A little bit about the apparatus that we've developed in the field of electronic literature that's been essential, because when we started doing this, libraries didn't know what to do with these objects, right? And it's a big problem for us who teach it, because a lot of these things last about 5 years before they face technological obsolescence. So as a field, we've had to develop an apparatus to document and to archive and to track and map this field, just so that we could be able to teach the material that we saw 10 years ago to students who are just beginning to encounter it today. And again, I'd mentioned one of the most important databases is here, Rui Torres and Manuel both work on the POEX archive, which links experimental Portuguese poetry and Portuguese electronic literature. And then finally, some thoughts on the future. Okay, then on to teaching. I want to just go through really quickly 4 different ways that I have and do teach electronic literature and think about it. One is, I'm missing a closed parenthesis. One is part of a literary studies curriculum, and we've heard a lot of people today who are doing this, and yesterday. So you can teach it as a literature course in, say, English or Portuguese, or a foreign language course, or a comparative literature course. And some of these can be combined, obviously, or are combined. You can teach it as a creative writing course, specifically, where the main focus is on creative media production, is on making stories and poetry in digital media. One of the things I've been doing a bit more recently is, say, my graduate courses in digital media aesthetics that are a little bit more critically focused. We'll read books, but then we'll also bring in some of these objects and analyze them together. And I'll talk about how we do that. And then we teach a digital humanities course where our students work on research infrastructure and learn about the broader digital humanities while working with electronic literature. So these are the 4 courses that we currently teach at the University of Bergen, where that I was able to work electronic literature in over the course of my years there. The first one is a course in digital genres. In this course, our students look at computer games, digital art, and electronic literature. All of these informed by thinking about genre and comparing the techniques and modalities, modes of expression in art, literature, and games together. So there's a module on electronic literature in there. We have a course called Electronic Literature, where typically they'll look at 3 genres of electronic literature, and it'll be pretty much divided almost evenly in half sort of history and critical approaches, where I'm using this book now. But then the other half is creative practice. And actually, in the last few years, I've moved towards their work, their final projects, are actually creative projects. And it's been a good move that the students really get a lot out of that, I think. Then our digital humanities course and our graduate seminar in digital media aesthetics, which changes topics each term. Okay, so I've been teaching for 17 years this sort of material. And when I first started, I was teaching in New Jersey. I got hired to start a new media studies track in a literature program. And people mention a lot of barriers when you're talking about teaching electronic literature, so I thought I'd mention an interesting reversal that occurred. When I was teaching in a literature program, and this was 15 years ago, students would look at this at ELIT and they'd say, how do I work this? It's like a complicated gizmo. What does this have to do with reading? Can't we just get novels and poetry? This is a literature class, man. So they were kind of hung up on, how do I traverse this thing to get to the story or to get to the poetry? Now, our students are a little bit more diverse, but they have some technological training and they think a lot about digital culture, but they'll say things like, when they first encounter it, this is an interesting interface, great use of JavaScript and CSS. Let me describe to you how this is working as a computer program. You want me to draw a map and explain how it works for you? But why do you want me to read it? I can get it without reading anything. Right? So I think now the trouble for me, or the challenge, the trick for me, is to get the students to actually to read. It's no longer explaining to them how to traverse the textual machine. It's how to read. I'm going to go quickly through this because I want to get to the creative part of it without going over time. But I want to just show you really quickly sort of an example of how, when I'm talking about these things, and in this book, how we weave in literary tradition and technological tradition. So when I'm talking about combinatory poetics, I'll often start, there are examples further back, but I'll often start with the Dada and Christian Zara's great instructions on how to make a Dadaist poem, which is essentially to take a newspaper, cut out the pieces, cut out words from the article, put them into a paper bag, shake them gently, dump them on the floor, remove one word at a time, and sort of arrange those words in the order that you get them into lines, and then copy conscientiously. And now the poem will be like you. You will have become an infinitely original writer with a charming sensitivity, although still misunderstood by the common people. And I do this, I start out the section on combinatory poetics, I actually do this with students. The remarkable thing, though, is when you take a newspaper from contemporary time, from a given day, and you cut out words from it and you rearrange them, something interesting happens in that because it has that shared context and that shared moment in time, it performs an act of defamiliarization. And the poem is almost, most of the time, turns out to read as interesting poetry. So there's something to this sort of the characteristic of just aleatory poetics. Of course, the surrealists expanded on this. They were trying to access the logic of dreams, and they did all sorts of different collective writing experiments, or trying to write from the unconscious in different ways. One of the famous ones, of course, is the exquisite corpse, where either with text or writing, one person will write a line or start a drawing, fold it over, pass it to the next person, pass it on until you've filled up a page, and then you'll end up with a poem that was written by everyone and written by no one, right? And that involved elements of chance. And many of these, like for instance, there's a great collection of these at the Art Institute of Chicago, are actually quite remarkable, in that they are these art objects that no one thought of, but are nonetheless fascinating. A more famous writer who used a similar method was the novelist William S. Burroughs, where he would cut up both texts that he had written and audio tapes, and he would splice in newspaper articles in novels like Naked Lunch. But when he was commenting on his friend and colleague William Geison's cut-up technique, he pointed out that the best writing almost always seems done by accident, but writers, until the cut-up method was made explicit, had no way to produce the accident of spontaneity, that you couldn't just sit down and will spontaneity. But you can introduce unpredictable, spontaneous factors with a pair of scissors. A classic work, and this is one that I sort of imitated in the work that I was showing, the film that I was showing, of combinatory poetics, is Raymond Queneau's The Ulipan Poets, 100,000 Billion Poems. This is a work where it's 10 to the 14th power of poem by virtue of the fact that Queneau wrote out 10 sonnets, but with lines flexible enough that they could interact with in the line places with any of the other sonnets written there, and then cut the page into strips. So instead of 10 sonnets, you suddenly had 100,000 billion sonnets. The Ulipo is very important, and the idea of constrained writing is very important for combinatory poetics. Harry Matthews is a writer who developed a bunch of interesting constraints. And the Ulipo is a group of writers and mathematicians who get together in Paris for dinner once a month and deliver challenges to each other. There's some very famous ones, like George Perec's write a novel without using the letter E, which is La Disparition in French. But he makes this point that constraints have a creative effect in that we become so busy concentrating on the effect, this sort of object of desire to us, that if we find ourselves doing and saying things we never would have otherwise, things that turn out to be exactly what we need to reach our goal. And I was sort of friends with Harry, and he told me the story of where Perec came up with the idea for Avoid, the novel without the letter E, which was that he really wanted to write about his parents' disappearance during the Holocaust, but it was too close to him for him to be able to write effectively about it until he focused on this constraint of not using the letter E. And of course, I won't talk about all these, but computer programs are inherently constrained, right? That's essentially what you're doing when you're writing a computer program, is writing a set of constraints that the computer program will then perform. There's a whole tradition of performance scripts, such as the Fluxus, One very simple, and this might sound like, oh, why would a literature professor cite these? Mad Libs are something that probably some of you are familiar with from your childhood, where you take, you have a given text and you have a set of types of words that you can substitute in and out. Many text generators, computer story generators, work according to similar principles. And that childish joy of discovery, I think, is something that's familiar to many of us. I won't go into all of these examples, but there's also a really close connection with the generative music tradition. One wonderful thing I found out a few years ago that I didn't realize was that, for instance, David Bowie used generative software to write many of his lyrics. So if anybody says like electronic literature is never going to be a popular art form, I give you David Bowie, ladies and gentlemen. The history of this stretches back to technological experimentation. Many of the people who wrote the first generators weren't setting out to be digital poets. Probably the first one by Christopher Strachey was the love letter generator. And if we look at a text like this saying, "Duck, duck, you are my little affection, my beautiful appetite, my eager hunger, my covetous love lusts for your infatuation. My yearning anxiously clings to your fellow feeling, yours eagerly, M.U.C." Now, this doesn't seem like a really effective love letter necessarily. It seems in many ways like a parody of a love letter. Interesting thing about Christopher Strachey is he was rumored to be a lover of Alan Turing. Actually, he was a gay man in the 1950s in the UK. So there's a bit of theory around this piece that one of the things that he was doing was sort of making fun of courting traditions or heterosexual conventions. And of course, MUC is actually the Manchester University computer that he offered. Another work from the 1950s, Stochastic Text by Theo Lutz. I can't really read the German, and I don't have the. Oh, I lost the slide with the English. But one of the fascinating things about this, and I don't have the slide with the English, so only those of you who speak German will understand this. But this was just to see if he could write a computer program that would generate aleatory texts. However, the poetry is actually kind of interesting. One of the reasons for this is that he was using titles from Kafka novels as the corpus of his text. But you end up with some really interesting texts as a result of this very simple form of generation. Probably the first poet explicitly to say, I want to set out and create something that generates poet is Alison Knowles, who worked with the composer James Tenney, who actually had a sort of residency at Xerox Labs in 1967 and said, hey, why don't we try to make something with this computer? So they wrote the computer program, A House of Dust, that generates very simple poems that describe a place, a house of dust, to the sea, and then it has another element, lighting, and then inhabited by X. The fascinating thing about this is they use this as the basis for many other art projects, including in addition to the poem, they built some installations. So they would generate these and then build architectural installations. They also did a poetry drop where they got a helicopter and they printed off about 10,000 pages of this poem and then dropped it from the helicopter to a waiting audience. A fascinating, absurdist project. Probably not the first. I think Pedro Barbosa would disagree. But what was claimed to be the first book written by a computer, The Policeman's Beard is Half Constructed, by Rachter, is a fascinating work. People didn't believe when this was published that it was actually generated by a computer program. They said, "Oh, you must have been cheating." It was a pretty good program with a complex grammar, generative grammar. But it would produce poems like, slowly I dream of flying, I observe turnpikes and streets studded with bushes. Coldly my soaring widens awareness. To guide myself determinedly, start to kill my pleasure during the time that hours and milliseconds pass away. Aid me in this. And soaring is formidable. Do not, and winging is unhinged. They never revealed, although people have found bits of the code of Ractor enough to sort of prove that it was being generated. And there's different models of generation that I discuss in the book. This was one of the more complex ones. But another interesting thing is I think what made this book so interesting was both the text, but then these fabulous collages that were done by an artist that sort of tried to interpret the generative poetry. There's also a tradition in story generation. In the first electronic literature collection, you'll find this very simple generator that I often use in class called Storyland. That's fascinating that I think it generates the sort of the basic minimalist elements of a story you could possibly put together and call a story. And yet they actually read pretty well for stories of about 6 lines long, and demonstrate that you don't really need much. You don't really need much to hang a plot on for people to interpret it as a story. I'm gonna skip ahead here because otherwise I'm not gonna have time to get to the teaching. But I just want to point out that there's many different ways that people are thinking of where does the art reside in a work of combinatory poetics. So for example, Nick Montfort has done a series of obscurely famous generators called the PPG 256 series, where he's taking an idea from computer programming, which is the idea of the elegant program, the program that wastes no space, that has the minimalist use of code possible. And then each of these are Perl programs that generate poetry of a kind. I'm not a huge fan of the actual output, but the remarkable thing about this is what can you do with just 256 letters to produce a program that generates a kind of poetry that can be read by humans as poetry. And I won't go through all of these. One of the pieces I did was called a frequency poetry generator. I wrote 2,000 constrained lines of a poem using only the 200 most used words in the English language. I wrote 10 lines beginning with each of these words. And then I wrote a program in Ruby where it essentially asks you what type of poem you'd like. Would you like a haiku? Would you like a sonnet? Would you like a snowball? There's about 15 different types of poetry. And then the computer program selects from those 2,000 lines and delivers a poem in that given form. The interesting thing is the traditional formal poems are almost always bad, if I try to do a sonnet or something like that with this. But I realized that because of the character counting capabilities, you could actually invent some new forms. So for example, snowballs work well, but things like two towers is one of these, where the computer program selects a number of characters to build one tower and another tower, and then creates this kind of poem that you read across. Yeah, and there's plenty more to say about that piece, but I won't. Evolution by Johannes Haldine's a fascinating work where they were trying to take the style of Johannes Haldine, and he said, what I'm trying to do is to make myself irrelevant. So we're going to create a computer program that studies my work and mimics my style, and then I'll stop writing poetry. So it doesn't exactly do that. But it's a fascinating program. Then there's things like Pentametron, which is a bot that finds couplets. My profile looks exotic. Who agrees? I absolutely love Alicia Keys. Can you imagine heading back in time? High resolution picture of a line, right? Or the similar Times haiku at the New York Times, which finds within the articles within given text articles, it finds naturally occurring haiku, and then publishes them every once in a while. So these are just accidental haiku that a computer program recognizes. And then Jave's recent work, Big Data Poetry, which I think is going to be sort of highlighting a new trend where we can sort of feed neural nets a corpus of texts. And then what Jave did was for, I think it was 6 months or 8 months, every morning he woke up to a huge body of text produced by the computer and then spent the day editing these computer poems. So he was writing, he was interacting with them, but then at the end of the day he'd have, say, 10 new poems, and at the end of each month he published a book of poetry that was co-authored by him and by the machine. And I think this is a sort of really interesting reversal of roles here, where the human becomes the text editor. All right, on to teaching. Some core ideas that I use when I'm teaching ELIT. One is I try to inform the writing by reading and knowledge of existing works and genres. I think not enough people who teach electronic literatures, creative writing actually do this. I think people sort of leap in and just say, okay, here's a tool, make something with it, right? Whereas I think it's useful to step back and say, okay, what's been done before? Let's get an awareness of the area that we're working in. I also emphasize collaborative practice. Most of my work over many years has been made with other people. I love to collaborate, and I think one of the great joys of the network and digital media is that it's really can be a social practice of co-creation. I try to allow students who are strong in particular areas, say a student's really good at writing and others good at editing, somebody's a visual artist, a musician, some people are stronger at using code, and part of the reason why we do things in groups a lot is to say, all right, well, you focus on that. Use your particular talents. I try to emphasize ideas, stories, poetics over techniques. In other words, I'm not teaching a course in a given software platform. I'm not teaching people to use Photoshop or C++, Python, CSS, etc. I'll try to support that and send them places and give them opportunities to learn these things. But what I want the students to focus on is what they're making and how to, and think about from a scalable model of how they can tell a story. So we try to also spend quite a bit of the time looking at the work that they're doing and talking about it together, sharing it, not creating a one, just professor to student, but as a group. And then I always, I'm not trying to create a professional class of ELIT writers. It would be virtually impossible to do so because very few people actually get paid to be ELIT writers, right? So I'm always trying to think, what are they going to learn as a result of doing this? Digital literacy, things like project management, things like how to encounter digital media as a creative space rather than one that you're just sort of fed content from, right? Because most of my students will go on and do other things, and that's certainly the case in our digital culture program. We're not trying to get people published in the New Yorker. So really quickly, 4 examples of assignments that I do. The first one is to hack a gorge. The second one is to work with interactive narrative and twine. Another one is to create a locative narrative. And the third is to perform a net prof. So the story behind Chiroko Gorge and Tokyo Garage, Nick Montfort, a close friend of mine, created a poetry generator that's a nature poetry generator called Chiroko Gorge, about a national park in Taiwan that I really liked because this sort of inversion, I'm going to create this sort of machine-based form that creates a poem about waterfalls and gently flows over time and continues generating this. And I love the elegance of the code. When I looked at the code that Nick had written, as always, very tight, minimalistic code. And I looked at the language and I said, geez, that's not very much language. What if I decided to improve it? So what I did, as sort of a joke for Nick, primarily to amuse an audience of one, was I took Nick's Chiroko Gorge and changed all of the vocabulary changed some very basic elements of the way the poem displays on the page and the speed at which it displays. Retitled it Tokyo Garage, and then crossed out Nick's name and put mine under it, and then published it on the internet. And then I sent an email to Nick saying, Nick, look what I did, I improved your poem. And he loved that. So what I did is I took his minimalist vocabulary and then made it very much maximalist, right? And I took an idea of a poem about nature and I turned it into a poem about cities and cosmopolitanism and about Tokyo, or an idea of Tokyo. The interesting thing that happened after this was I published this, then Nick wrote a blog post about it. A few weeks later, J.R. Carpenter did the same thing, except that she wrote hers called Gorge. So this became a poem about eating and gorging yourself. Someone else then, a few weeks later, wrote Taikei George about the Star Trek hero. Someone else wrote one about the Beatles, Yoko and Gorge, a sort of pornographic poem about the Beatles and John and Yoko in bed. And then this kept going and going and going, and before we knew it, I think about 30 different authors had done this, and it became its own genre in a way, right? This very simple computer program that spawned all these other versions. So I do that as an assignment with my class now, and it's a great assignment. And they all do something different with it. It's a very kind of low entry assignment. They can, if they're good at imagery, if they're good at language, if they're good at coding, they can expand upon this code base in different ways. And they all come with their own version of the poem. So a great thing about this assignment, anyone who can work with words can do it. It exposes students to code without demanding immediate background knowledge of programming. It really effectively demonstrates the poetic power of recombination. It can scale up and down for different skill levels. And it shows, and this is something I emphasize in the book, that writing, coding, and playing are very related. All these things are, coding is a form of writing. Writing is a form of play. Twine, we've heard a bit about today. It's a great platform. I won't talk too much about it. Jose Diaz gave an excellent talk on teaching with Twine. Wonderful thing about Twine, though, an open source software platform, that there was an early piece of hypertext software called StorySpace that was pre-web, was very proprietary, but had some great features that you didn't actually have if you were just authoring HTML in the web. Chris Klimas said, I like these features. I'm going to create an open source software that integrates the best features of StorySpace or similar features, such as like visual mapping of text. And I'm also going to be thinking about this as not only a hypertext writing system, but also as an interactive fiction writing system. I've just started using this in the last couple of years. My students have leapt into it. It's an immediate writing environment that they encounter, and whether they think they're writers or not when they start, they really discover, as you said, they discover a voice somehow. And it's very conducive to writing. So my students came up with some really brilliant projects doing all sorts of different things. There was a murder mystery on a train. There were different sorts of children's fictions. There were mythological tales. A lot of my students are international. I told them they could write in French if they want. I can speak French, not Portuguese, unfortunately, or I can read French. And Norwegian, even like this student, was someone who wanted to work with educational technology. So he wrote a story that it was a basic story, a children's story, but it also was like teaching math and basic reading and he was kind of trying to map it onto some Norwegian education objectives. So it was just remarkable, the kinds of things they came up with. So a great thing about Twine, again, low learning curve. You don't need a lot to get into it, but it's highly extensible. So if you have programming knowledge, you can build upon that. It integrates the best features of that early software and elements of interactive fiction software, and exposes students to those conventions. So they read the chapters on hypertext and interactive fiction. they have some background, and then they leap into Twine. It's immediately interactive. You can embed images and sounds, so there's multimedia. It's immediately publishable, shareable, and there's this large, young, enthusiastic user community. So students have questions about some technical aspect of Twine. I just say, go to the Twine community, and they find people who respond to them and support them. Another sort of assignment, again, I won't go into too much, but this is one we did when Mark Marino was a visiting researcher with us, and I've done a number of these different sort of locative narratives, and these can be very simple technologically, right? The thing I like about them is I say, okay, we've been spending all this time in front of the screen. Take a notebook, take a pen, go out in the city, and I want you to write a fragment of a story set in a particular space, right? And then we can use technology to map these things together. One really simple way we did with this project was like Google Maps, right? We could also use like QR codes and stickers where you take your phone out and you see a QR code on a public space and you get delivered a chunk of story. You could use AR to do this, right? But building stories together in a physical space and sort of getting that idea that electronic literature doesn't need to mean, I'm just diving into the screen, but it can mean we're getting out into the world and telling stories in new ways. So there's concrete sets of constraints. You need to work in a physical environment. You get to think beyond the screen, and it's ideal in a way for teams of people to do this. The other sort of, I'm sorry, were you taking a picture? The other great form that we use a lot, and I do, again, with Mark Marino and Rob Wittig, do this every semester. They have NetProvs, where they encourage people from universities all over the world to join in, and just writers to join in. I play along with these a lot. You can, of course, generate your own, but the idea is network-based improvisational writing in everyday platforms. So saying, all right, what if we decide we're going to do, the most common one that they use is Twitter, right? Or Facebook or Instagram or Periscope or any of these sorts of TikTok, any of these kinds of platforms that people, and especially young people, are using every day. But let's have a premise that we start with. So for instance, the one we did with my students last term and with some of their students was Behind Your Back. So the idea of this was that, okay, the social media platform you use every day suddenly logs you out, and you can't log into it, but you keep getting notifications, and people are commenting on you, but you can't see the comments. So you don't know exactly what's going on. So this was sort of the premise, right? And then we generated characters. I made a little character generator, and each student hit a button and got a piece of paper with a character that had a certain background and certain concerns, certain things they were worrying about. And then we all jumped into the Twitter flow, use a hashtag, and all of a sudden we're joining this story that's being collaboratively developed by sometimes 50, 100 people, right? And NetProvs is a separate topic. They're sort of steered in various ways, in that plot elements will be introduced by the people directing them. But if you haven't tried them, both for your students and just for yourself, I would say, it's great fun and a great example of collective writing, which is something I also write about in the book. So we're running pretty close to out of time now. But some different things about this assignment that I think are useful. We're considering the constraints, effects, and uses of social media. This also allows us to look at this from a critical standpoint. Often the themes are critical of our everyday practices on the internet. There's a kind of role-playing happening. It's responsive. Something that's really rewarding for students, I think, is that they're not just getting feedback from Professor Riteberg or whoever, but other people are writing back to them and playing along with them. It complicates this idea of digital genre, in that it's like, is it writing? Is it a performance? Is it a play? Is it a novel? Is it just Twitter? What does it mean? And then it gives us a sort of environment of reflective critique. The sorts of things that I do in our digital media aesthetic course, I'll often take a given theme that we'll think about. For example, the relationship between environmental studies and the digital humanities. And then we might read books, for instance, like UC Parika's kind of critique of the effects of computation on the geology of our planet, or Lisa Swanstrom's Animal, Vegetable, Digital, or Soren Pold's The Meta-Interface. And these are works that are theoretical and deal with themes, but also often deal with digital artworks. And I might use the ones that are discussed in those books, or bring in new ones and say, all right, let's look at this theoretical framework, and then let's look at these art artifacts and think about how we write about these within that frame. Right? Or for instance, if we were going to be, if we're going to look at social media and large internet companies from a critical standpoint, we might look at one of Roberto's books, or The Googleization of Everything, or the novel The Circle by Dave Eggers, and then look at projects like the American Psycho project that was discussed during Roberto's keynote, or John Cayley's How It Is in Common Tongues, which is actually virtually identical to the text of Samuel Beckett's How It Is, except that all of the phrases an algorithm searched for and found all of the phrases in the book on Google searches, and then cites those individually, thus demonstrating both the sort of absurdity of the copyright regime and also how Google encloses and, in a sense, owns language. Or Ad Nauseum by Daniel Howe, which is a plugin that clicks on every ad on a given page and then delivers those images back to you, creating a profile for you of who Facebook and the advertisers think you are. Or the NetProv, I Work for the Web, which was a project where all the characters realized that they were spending most of their time clicking and liking things and putting a lot of labor into this. And suddenly there was an uprising of the common web content producers who decided to go on strike with the Webblies union to protest their treatment. And then finally, and this is something that I know is done, at least I know that Rui does similar things with some of his students, there's a lot of technological infrastructure involved in electronic literature. We host one of the largest database, open access research databases on electronic literature at the University of Bergen, the ELMSIP Electronic Literature Knowledge Base, which if you haven't checked out, I encourage you to use and to contribute to. But we have a course where we're studying the digital humanities broadly, but then students work very specifically with our database, both developing it and learning from it. So they're contributing to the large-scale documentation of the field. They're learning about theory, debates, context of digital humanities. They're getting kind of very specific research training in databases and archives. And then what they do is they develop individual research collections, which are sort of mini databases within the database that are based on research questions. Then we teach them how to do some data mining and visualization using the database. So a few examples of the types of research collections, and these weren't all done by students. I threw this one in for Luciana. Unfortunately, she's not here, but she developed a research collection when she was a postdoc with us on Brazilian electronic literature. I think the video is not linked right now, but there's a great interview with Manuel and Rui in done by Alvaro Seixas. That's part of the Portuguese electronic literature collection. So these are things that are in the wider database, but then they're a kind of focused set of things. But also things that are thematic, like Hannah Ackerman's, one of our current PhD students, is doing one that's specifically on interventions of digital texts in physical spaces. And then for their final projects, what the students will do is develop a specific research question. Like there was a philosophy student who took the course who was saying, I'm really interested in Wittgenstein's concept of language games, and what I'd like to do is go through the database and map given works using vocabulary from Wittgenstein, and then visualize to see how these Wittgenstein's terms might apply to ludic works on the web. So these are, I'm wrapping up now, but those are sort of four different approaches, each different types of courses, right? So it's one of the things I want to emphasize in the book, that there's not a cookie cutter a way of teaching electronic literature, but in fact this body of material is rich in many different types of teaching contexts. Yeah, so, and I haven't mentioned much the primary and secondary context, but some recommendations I would have in addition to universities if you're teaching primary, secondary. Consider, invite authors and digital artists in the schools just to expose students to work. Make workshops where students get engaged in the creation in digital media. There's a whole subset of work that we did a project called TDLIC, and I know there's one happening in Portugal now as well that Rui mentioned. And there's been similar projects in France and other places. But we did a series of exhibitions across the Nordic countries of just really innovative interactive ebooks and other types of digital literature made specifically for children. And that's beginning to develop as a field within children's literature as well. Again, think about all these different contexts: digital literacy, art, children's literature, English and foreign language, where this work can be materially useful. Okay, just to conclude, for those of you, most of you are familiar now with the field, but there's a bunch of electronic literature out there available for free. The electronic literature collections published by the Electronic Literature Organization are a great place to start. There have been 3 volumes now, each with more than, I think, 50 works. The last one was immense. They went crazy, the number of works that they published. But to get a sense of the diversity of approaches that writers are taking, this is a great place to go. When the ELMSIP project, 2010 to 2013, we put out the first specifically trans-European collection that included a number of works in many different languages. Of course, the electronic literature knowledge base. And by the way, I hope that all of you who presented at this conference will, if you don't have an account, ask for an account in the database and create a record of your presentation and of your creative and critical work. And finally, a bonus that goes along with this book that's available for free. I worked with a graduate student, and for every chapter of this book, we created a separate research collection within the knowledge base that has links to all of the documentation of all of the creative works, all of the critical writing referenced, all of the authors that were referenced in those individual chapters. So if anyone's thinking about teaching this book, that's a great additional supplement to use when you're teaching that. So I know I threw a lot at you very fast, but I hope that this presentation was useful. So thanks, tusen tack, muito obrigado.